Good evening. This is Domino Network News. I'm Derek Domino. Tonight's main story, the Irish Civil War rages on between the EU-backed puppet regime in Dublin and the People's Popular Resistance Movement, who are fighting to halt the government's stated aim to replace the Irish native population with people born elsewhere. We'll have reports on the various battles currently ongoing around the country. But first, I spoke to a government spokesman the other day about the ongoing conflict, asking him if he was comfortable with his government pushing ahead with this replacement policy, some calling it a government-backed invasion policy, even though all the polling suggests that 80% of the Irish population are against it. His response to me, and I quote, "Polls, we don't need no stinking polls." When pressed that his words could be seen as in some way offensive to the large Polish community here, he simply threatened to have me arrested for hate speech, only to then remember they hadn't passed the latest draconian hate speech laws just yet. I decided not to press the matter further. I then spoke to one of the leaders of the resistance, asking him how they could possibly succeed against all the forces ranged against them. The government regime, the mainstream media, various government-backed auxiliaries, and not least the might of the EU itself. His reply was stark. This is a struggle for the very existence of we the Irish as a unique and distinct people in the world. We will fight to the last man, woman, and child, as did our ancestors before us. Stirring words indeed. Our first report tonight comes from the Battle of Newtownmountkennedy, where government forces, after a protracted battle,
He's on his knees! I'm a journalist! Press!
have finally declared victory. It seems the deployment of the elite Garda Riot Squad division proved too much for the local resistance, and they were overwhelmed. A government spokesman at the scene declared that hostilities had indeed ended and that phase 1 of the government's local population replacement had been completed, with foreign men having now been installed in a newly constructed barracks at the site. Locals admitted this to be true and expressed disappointment at the outcome of the battle, but vowed to continue their opposition to the illegitimate regime in every way possible. Our next report comes from the south side suburb of Dublin, Ballyogan, where a battle is ongoing. A full frontal assault the other day by governmental forces was repulsed by the local resistance. Buses of young, immigrant, mostly African and Asian men being repulsed and prevented entry. This assault proving to be unsuccessful. The buses were forced to retreat. Stung by this initial rebuke, the regime changed tactics, sending in some crack detachments to remove the men from the protest.
What happened this morning was we were all standing here just making sure, now they were in coaches yesterday, they've gotten now into taxis, so they're in smaller little groups trying to get in. We didn't let the food bus in, then the taxis were coming in. They were nearly hitting us. Garda came, more Garda than there was us protesting. They all came, targeted the men, arrested the men, all the men were gone. Then they started pushing the women out. There was 2 barricades of Garda and they let all the taxis in.
A government security forces operative who wished to remain anonymous commented to me off the record, "We like to take the men out first. That way the lads only have to deal with women and children. It makes for a much easier shift. And Lord knows we're not getting paid enough to deal with them lads in full battle." This strategy seemed to prove effective for the regime, as a short time later, taxis began to arrive with men, mostly of African and Asian appearance, arrived and were ushered through by the security forces of the state. The women and children left manning the barricades, seemingly ineffective under this onslaught. Our next report comes from the tiny village of Cool in Westmeath, where, as one government official put it to me anonymously, they were trying to, as he put it, do a Listún Varna to the local community, that is, wipe them out in one quick assault, make them a minority in their own village overnight. Regime forces, on this occasion, having underestimated the strength of resolve that this handful of villagers would have for their small, tight-knit community against the onslaught of globalism. Auxiliary forces loyal to the Dublin government removed themselves from the scene and retreated to a car park in Mullingar to reassess the situation and come up with new tactics. They launched a second full frontal assault at the dead of night, hoping to catch the villagers unawares.
Come on here and see how many there is. See now then, Pat the baker is trying to get their bread delivered and they can't because the whole village of Cool is being tied up with modular homes. The ones we were told weren't going to be put into Cool. Well done lads, well done.
In relation to the Cool village debacle, I pressed a government minister who declined to go on the record as to whether the government were considering deploying foreign mercenaries to the cool front. He simply responded by saying, "At this time, all options are on the table." Our last report this evening comes from the Battle of Clonmel, where a particularly visceral confrontation has been going on between forces loyal to the regime, auxiliaries and local resistance fighters. At stake, among many other things, according to locals, was a 200-year-old tree, which, according to them, still embodied the spirit of the ancient fairies. It seems modern Ireland wasn't only consigned to having its fairies in Parliament, but also in ancient trees, fairy forts and other such things. Clashes on the Clonmel front were particularly contentious between resistance elements and government-backed auxiliaries. The first group of auxiliaries being forced from the field entirely, only to be replaced a day later with another group of auxiliaries brought up from the rear. A number of tracked vehicles were burnt out at the scene, locals blaming climate change, which seems to be particularly acute in some parts of Tipperary. Still others stated that it may have been the spirit of the fairies in the ancient tree, bidding to protect themselves from would-be harassers. When I put this to a government spokesman, he simply replied with the word bollocks. Indeed, the government forces were dealt something of a blow when the rental firms, which had rented this plant and machinery to the auxiliaries, simply refused to rent them any more machinery. I spoke to one representative of one of the companies involved in the rental scheme, who told me that, and I quote, "We can't keep giving these lads expensive plant and machinery when they bring it back to us looking like a piece of burnt toast." The resistance were given a further boost when one patriotic young Irishman promptly downed tools and left the site, joining his countrymen and women on the other side of the fence. He was given a fitting hero's welcome. I'm happy to report that he has since found alternative employment with patriots, no doubt, who love their country. Once again, the government-backed auxiliary forces were forced to retreat. As yet, there has been no new developments. We have reports of other skirmishes and clashes between members of the resistance and government regime forces in Coolock, Ballina, Naas, Kill, Roscrea, Lismore, Mullingar and many other places. It seems this civil war is far from over. In fact, many commentators are now saying it's only set to get worse.